On paper, this flight should not be possible. A passenger aircraft leaves Singapore, crosses thousands of miles of open ocean, and reaches New York nearly 19 hours later without stopping for fuel. There is no runway halfway across the Pacific, no second aircraft waiting if something goes wrong, and no easy way to add more fuel once the aircraft is airborne. Yet Singapore Airlines operates this route routinely, using an Airbus A350-900ULR specifically engineered for the job. The real problem is not finding space for enough fuel. It is the fact that fuel has weight. A long-haul aircraft can carry well over 100 tons of fuel, but every kilogram of that fuel must itself be lifted, accelerated, and carried for the entire flight. Add more fuel and the aircraft becomes heavier, which requires more energy, which requires more fuel. So the farther you try to fly, the less useful each additional kilogram of fuel becomes. Engineers call this the fuel weight paradox, and it is one of the fundamental reasons extreme range is so difficult. That is why the solution was not simply to give the A350 a bigger fuel tank. Engineers had to rethink what the aircraft was carrying. The A350-900ULR was optimized to hold roughly 17% more fuel than the standard version without simply adding another external tank, but that extra fuel would be almost useless if the aircraft remained too heavy everywhere else. So Singapore Airlines reduced the passenger capacity dramatically. The aircraft carries just 67 business class seats and 94 premium economy seats, with no economy cabin at all. Removing an entire cabin sounds like a commercial decision, but it is really part of the range equation. Every passenger means another seat, another piece of cabin equipment, more baggage, more food and water, and more weight that the aircraft has to carry for 19 hours. On a flight this close to the aircraft's range limit, even small weight savings can determine whether the route works. And the fuel on board is not all available simply for reaching New York. Over the middle of an ocean, the aircraft has to preserve enough fuel to handle an emergency diversion. Under the relevant operating requirements, the aircraft can be more than 6 hours from a suitable emergency airport if an engine fails over open water. So the aircraft is solving several problems simultaneously: enough fuel to reach the destination, enough reserve for emergencies, and low enough weight to make the fuel itself practical. But even after engineers solve the aircraft, there is one more variable they cannot control: the atmosphere. At cruising altitude, enormous rivers of air called jet streams can move at hundreds of miles per hour. If the aircraft gets a strong tailwind, the atmosphere effectively helps carry it toward its destination. With a strong headwind, the same aircraft can burn substantially more fuel just fighting its way through the air. That means the shortest route is not always the most efficient route. Ultra-long-haul aircraft can deliberately take a longer path if the winds make that route cheaper in fuel. The curved flight paths you see on a map are therefore not simply geographical quirks. They are the result of optimizing the aircraft against the atmosphere itself. And when an aircraft is already using most of its available range, that optimization becomes critical. A route that is slightly longer on the map can still be the better engineering choice if favorable winds reduce the total energy required. But fuel is not the only endurance problem. The aircraft may be capable of staying airborne for 19 hours, but the human body was never designed to spend 19 hours inside a pressurized aluminum cabin while crossing 12 time zones. Cabin air is extremely dry, cabin pressure is lower than at sea level, and passengers remain seated for most of the journey. Meanwhile, the body's circadian rhythm has to deal with a sudden shift between local times that would normally take days to experience. So ultra-long-haul aviation turns passenger comfort into an engineering problem as well. Cabin lighting can be programmed around the destination time zone, while meals can be timed to help passengers gradually adjust to the new schedule. Even food has to be considered differently because low humidity and cabin pressure can reduce taste and smell perception, which changes how passengers experience meals. For the crew, the problem is more serious. A flight lasting almost an entire day cannot simply be operated by one crew working continuously. Multiple crews rotate through the flight, with pilots and other crew members resting in dedicated bunks hidden inside the aircraft. And researchers have found that fatigue is not as simple as becoming steadily more tired every hour. During Qantas research flights lasting more than 19 hours, pilots were monitored using EEG equipment and biological measurements. Their alertness did not decline in a perfectly predictable straight line. It fluctuated with workload, meal timing, sleep patterns, and the time of day, meaning a pilot could feel perfectly capable while physiological measurements showed that the brain was already responding differently. So the aircraft has to be engineered around two different kinds of endurance. The machine must have enough energy to remain airborne, while the humans inside must remain capable of operating safely. At this point, the obvious question is, why accept all of these compromises at all? Because the passenger is buying something the aircraft itself cannot manufacture. Time. A connecting flight allows an airline to carry more people with less extreme range requirements, but a connection also costs hours. On a journey this long, avoiding a stop can remove most of a day from the travel experience. For business travelers, that time can be worth far more than the extra cost of a non-stop ticket. So the economics of ultra-long-haul aviation are unusual. The aircraft is not designed to carry the maximum number of passengers. It is designed to carry enough high-value passengers far enough that eliminating the stop becomes commercially worthwhile. And this is exactly where the history of the aircraft reveals how fragile that equation really is. Singapore Airlines has already tried to solve this problem with a different aircraft. The airline previously operated non-stop Singapore to New York service using the 4-engine Airbus A350-900. Technically, the aircraft could make the journey, but economically it became impossible to justify. It burned almost 40% more fuel than the A350 that eventually replaced it, and rising fuel prices made the route unsustainable. The service disappeared in 2013. For 5 years, there was no non-stop Singapore to New York flight. Then the A350-900ULR changed the equation. That is an important lesson about engineering. A technology does not become successful simply because it works physically. It has to work economically under real-world conditions as well. And real-world conditions can change very quickly. In 2026, disruptions around the Strait of Hormuz pushed jet fuel prices sharply higher, demonstrating how vulnerable long-haul aviation remains to the price of the energy that makes these aircraft move. A route operating close to its economic limit can become far less attractive when fuel suddenly becomes more expensive. The same physics appears in cargo aviation, but with a different solution. A Boeing 747-8 freighter can carry roughly 148 tons of payload, but loading the aircraft that heavily dramatically reduces its range. A fully loaded aircraft cannot simply fly non-stop from Louisville to Hong Kong, so UPS can route through Anchorage to refuel before continuing. A box does not care how long the journey takes. A passenger paying a premium to avoid a connection does. That difference in what the customer values shapes the entire transportation system. And now Qantas is attempting to push the same boundary even farther. Through Project Sunrise, Qantas is preparing modified Airbus A350 aircraft designed for non-stop flights between Sydney and London, and eventually Sydney and New York, with flight times approaching 22 hours. The aircraft is being engineered around the same fundamental problem that created the Singapore route. Every extra mile requires more energy, but every extra kilogram of fuel makes the aircraft harder to carry. There is no single breakthrough that solves this. The solution is the aircraft as a whole. More efficient engines reduce fuel consumption. Aerodynamic improvements reduce drag. Structural design controls weight. Fuel capacity increases the available energy. Fewer passengers create more payload margin. Route planning uses the atmosphere to save fuel. Cruise systems manage human endurance. And every one of these decisions has to work together. That is why 19 hours is so close to the practical edge of passenger aviation today. The aircraft is already using most of its range. The fuel margin matters. Winds matter. Airspace matters. Fuel prices matter. And eventually, human endurance matters too. Yet aviation has always advanced in exactly this way. The limit is reached, engineers find a better compromise, and the boundary moves again. The world's longest flight is therefore not a story about an aircraft defeating physics. It is almost the opposite. It is a story about engineers understanding physics so precisely that they can operate right against its limits. Every kilogram of fuel has a consequence. Every seat has a consequence. Every change in wind changes the calculation. Every design decision determines how much farther the aircraft can go. And when all those decisions finally balance, something that once looked impossible becomes routine. A 19-hour flight is not an aircraft escaping the limits of physics. It is an aircraft engineered so efficiently that, for one extraordinary journey, the mathematics finally works.